Well, you're about to see two men take one of the biggest risks possible in pre-recorded television. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, as we record this early on Friday morning, it looks like there is going to be a vote in the U.S. Senate in the impeachment trial of President Trump to deny witnesses, and followed shortly either Friday or Monday by a vote to acquit the president. This doesn't really change anything that you've predicted along the way. And Bill, it would seem that if this all comes to pass, and by the time people see this video, they will probably know, that'll be the end of it. After all, the Democrats have failed to impeach the president. But already on CNN, there's talk of follow-up investigations, of calling former National Security Advisor John Bolton to testify before the House Intelligence Committee or elsewhere, and to continue this drumbeat. One of the questions that came up, Bill, on CNN is which party will pay the bigger price for its conduct during these impeachment hearings when it comes to the polls in November of 2020?
Well, I think maybe my first response to this would be I've seen some emails going around with photos of Trump rallies around the country, reelection rallies, and I've seen large numbers of people standing in sub-zero temperatures 8 hours, through the night before he was supposed to arrive in the morning. We had a good sense, I think, in 2016 about who was likely to win that election, not because of the poll numbers, because I don't trust those anymore, and I probably never should have. But we've talked about this before, Scott, about voter enthusiasm, how Hillary Clinton had 60 people in a gym and Donald Trump had 30, 40,000 people in an arena, had to turn away another 30, 40,000. Those numbers for Trump seem to have been bigger. So I bring all this up only to say that the original prediction that this impeachment thing is not going to change any minds, any significant number of minds, I think still stands. And I think it's a nature of how divided the politics in the country are, and how sort of idiosyncratic a person Donald Trump is that there's very little uncommitteds when it comes to him. People either like him or at the very least tolerate him, or they loathe him. And if I'd seen any real damage being done during the impeachment thing, I'd be a little more worried about it. But if anything, the numbers seem to indicate that his support is stronger.
Bill, to hear some of the more passionate, I was going to say virulent, but I guess passionate would be a nicer word, passionate Democrats on television, you would believe that the only question on the ballot in November is whether this corrupt president who managed to block his own impeachment by stonewalling the duly elected representatives of the people, whether he wins or not, as if the Democratic candidate for president were merely a mannequin, a placeholder, a plug score.
Right.
And that really the issue isn't, do we have a great candidate who's worthy to be president? It is, Democrats surely are going to rise up and throw this guy out.
Right. The Democrat position will be the Republic is in such horrid danger that we had to simply walk out on the street, grab the first person we could find, and have them run against Donald Trump just to put any citizen into the slot filled by this tyrant. And just by happy coincidence, the person we ran into on the street happened to be a guy who's run for president 3 or 4 times before, was found guilty of plagiarizing other people's speeches, and is in fact guilty of the kind of things that the president was accused of. But we're not going to let that slow down the narrative, because you're exactly right. That's how it's going to be spun. And look, one of the things that we've had to deal with in Low, these many episodes, has always ended up coming down to any sense of decency or comity is gone. And so now we're left with brass knuckle results. What are the results? So if it turns out that Donald Trump is acquitted, and the strategy of the left is to continue the witch hunt, to continue the impeachment, then that is an indication that they have learned absolutely nothing. And I personally feel that unless something really remarkable happens, and it's not going to happen in the impeachment trial, by the way, that they're going to take the kind of historical drubbing that often forces political parties to completely re-examine where they are and where they're going.
Let me ask you a question that I don't know if you're going to be able to evaluate, but I'll give it a shot anyway. How would the American public know that the Democratic leaders in the House and in the Senate were really serious about this, really believed that they had a violation of the Constitution, really had a conviction in their hearts that they were doing the right thing here? Like, what will be the after action indicator that they really believe what they were doing and it wasn't just all for political advantage?
How will the American people know that the Democratic leadership is essentially lying about the fact that they had legitimate grounds for impeachment?
No. This is not.
They'll be able to tell because their lips are moving.
No, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, I'm positing this idea that, as the Democrats say, this was a matter of grave constitutional import. And what I'm asking is, if you're an American voter looking at the House and at the Senate and considering your candidates in the fall election, how would you be able to evaluate, like, what would be an indicator that it really was to them a matter of grave constitutional import?
I don't know how to make that case. They will assert this, and they've been asserting this from the beginning. If it was a matter of grave constitutional import, there would be two things of note that are not here. One of them would be clear violations of law, and the second one would be bipartisan recognition of the fact that the president has committed serious crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors. Neither one of those is there. I thought it was especially interesting when Alan Dershowitz was on The View. Now, needless to say, I only saw a transcript because you can only get so close to that show. But Alan Dershowitz was on there defending the president, which in itself is a remarkable thing to see. And one of the women on The View, who is a former prosecutor, was arguing with him about this and that and about the witnesses thing. And she said, so you would have no problem acquitting him even though there were no other witnesses called in his defense? And Dershowitz said, because he was a defense attorney, obviously, Dershowitz said, yes, I've done that many times. She said, how can you possibly justify a thing? And he said, well, first of all, if all I had was a charge against my client of dishonesty and not a crime, and then the woman said, look, I'm a prosecutor. I would never indict anybody for just dishonesty and not a crime. And Dershowitz said, well, then you've just proven my point and completed the defense of President Trump.
Dershowitz took a lot of heat in recent hours, in fact, within the last couple of days, because one of the arguments he made, I mean, his first argument in front of the Senate was basically, even if President Trump did everything that the House has accused him of doing, it's not impeachable. His second argument was that anything the president does to get reelected is in its very nature okay to do because he believes that he's doing this for the good of the country. So he's making the argument that essentially a politician can do as he pleases in order to get reelected because he believes he doesn't have bad motives. He believes it's for the good of the country that he gets reelected, even if he did something wrong in the process of trying to do that.
The first argument is sound, and the second one is a big mistake. And it's a big mistake because it's just clearly an un-American thing. Forget even America. This whole thing for me turns on justice. It turns on rule of law, fairness, and the procedures that have been established over hundreds, if not thousands of years in order to solve the murky problem of people not being able to visit the past and see what actually happened. So the idea that this abuse of power is a definition, and that the definition, it's not a crime, it's certainly not listed as a crime. And so the definition of abuse of power is one that is so fluid that it could have been applied to any number of people. And in several articles I've said among the people it could have been applied to are George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Barack Obama, all of which could have been tried. I don't know whether they could have been convicted or not, but they could have been, or removed. They could have been tried on what people perceive to be an abuse of power. And the whole reason we have an executive branch is for the exercise of personal power. The executive branch personalizes the government of the United States, which is why the executive branch doesn't deal with the laws in terms of creating them anyway. The executive branch deals with things like point-to-point contacts with other executives from other countries who represent their people on a personal basis.
Bill, I thought it was an interesting argument, though, for Dershowitz. And just now, while you were talking, I think I realized why he made the argument. Because I have enough contact with politicians at the grassroots level to understand that practically every politician thinks that the fate of the republic hangs upon his or her reelection. And it just now occurred to me that the reason Dershowitz made that argument in front of the Senate was because every senator sitting there was thinking, well, yeah, I get that, because if I didn't get reelected, this country would be a much worse place. It's really important for me to get reelected. That has at least some traction with me. Not that it justifies illegal behavior, but I could get the idea that you need to get reelected.
Yes. And one of the things that we've been talking about that I mentioned early on in this process, and one of the reasons why the whole process as designed is so beautiful and how it's been executed and tried to be modified is so worrisome and disgraceful. I've been saying from the beginning, it is the job of, and everybody knows that this is what I've been saying, what everybody else has been saying, is it's the job of the House of Representatives to make the case. If they can't make the case, they shouldn't send articles of impeachment. In this particular case, they didn't have enough evidence to make this one single Republican vote. They sent the articles of impeachment after playing, coy and waiting for the flowers to arrive. But put all that aside, by having the House demand that the Senate calls witnesses, you begin to see why this procedure was designed in the first place. Because the number one thing that I think that Donald Trump's defense attorneys and anyone else who knows how these things work is concerned about. Dershowitz mentioned this specifically by name. He talked about perjury traps. And a perjury trap is something where you are defending yourself, which, as I said in our last episode, the president has no requirement to defend himself. He doesn't have to defend himself. He's innocent until proven guilty. He could sit on a yacht in the Cayman Islands and just drink margaritas and wait until the decision came in, because if there's not evidence to convict him, then he's not guilty, period. That's how it works. But the great danger in what the Democrats are doing, in trying to continue the investigation into the Senate, not the trial, the investigation, is they are setting a situation where it is almost unavoidable to walk into perjury traps. That doesn't mean that, we've caught you lying under oath. What it means is that statements that you might make under oath in terms of intent, in terms not of factual truth, but in terms of intent, in terms of plans, strategies, opinions, all of that, viewpoints, all of it. If you make those statements under oath and then you're called again afterwards, now that this whole thing is ongoing, and you say something different than what you said earlier, now the president is going to be removed from office on the basis of something that happened after the trial had started, which was probably certainly in the province of the House to do in the first place. So this is why we don't send a jury to deliberate a case and then have more evidence coming in while they're in the jury room talking about it. It is the job of the judge is not the prosecution.
Bill,
how else can I put that?
Final
the
question.
The judge is not the prosecution, and neither is the jury.
This is
yes.
This is an interesting thought, because now the Democrats have done something, because, again, as I said earlier, they would have the American public believe that they pursued this for apolitical reasons, purely because they believed that the executive branch had overstepped the bounds of the Constitution, and they believed that they would be, as the people's house, the check on that power, as our framers of the Constitution put it forth. And so now they're in a position where, assuming everything happens as we pre-record this on early Friday morning, they're in a position where if the president is acquitted, witnesses are not called, and the president can essentially proclaim victory and move on to reelection. Haven't the Democrats cornered themselves into a position where they almost have to keep probing, keep investigating, keep calling witnesses, keep trying to get documents, whether through their own subpoenas or going through the courts? They essentially, if they gave up now, everybody would say, oh, what was that? Just a sideshow for political benefit? You didn't really believe it?
Yes. In poker terms, they're pot committed now. All of their chips are in. This is their strategy for 2020, and it's way too late to change, as if they could change. The only way they would change their strategy, or would have, is if they'd had a viable series of political positions and viable candidates in order to deliver the message to the American people. They don't have either. The American people don't want progressivism in any form. And so their entire strategy, which is driven not only by political considerations, but deep psychotic levels of personal hatred, has been to tarnish Donald Trump and keep tarnishing him to the best of their ability to see if they can push the balance of favorables versus unfavorables into the area where he is less popular than popular, and therefore not so much the Democrats win the election as Donald Trump's personality loses it. I thought from the beginning that this strategy was not only disgraceful and dishonorable. These things don't surprise me coming from these people. But I also thought it was a losing strategy, because once we found out during the 2016 campaign, I don't think anybody on the night of the election had any misconceptions about who they were voting for and why. The idea that the Democrats seem to be married to, because it's the only idea they have, and certainly it's the only one they can process, is that if the American people only knew how loathsome Donald Trump really was, then certainly they would not vote for him, and they'd vote for their loathsome candidate. But that's not how it works with Donald Trump, and that's not how it ever worked with Donald Trump. It's not to say that Donald Trump is covered in Teflon to the degree that maybe Obama was or Reagan was, in the sense that the charges don't stick. On the contrary, Donald Trump is covered in terry cloth. Virtually all of these charges stick, and people don't care. They don't care because the charges are not charges that affect, number one, that are not criminal charges, and number two, that don't affect the governance of the nation. And this nation has been taken over by not only by elected officials who refuse to accept the results of an election, but also by high-level people in the government who have determined that it is they who will figure out what's best for the American people, whether we know it or not. And this is beyond discussion and beyond doubt. So we knew from the beginning what Donald Trump was in terms of his character, in terms of his background, and so on. And we didn't elect him Pope. We elected him president because he seems to be the only person on the board who has the skin thick enough to simply disregard this and to fight back in the manner in which he's being attacked. And my hope would be that, well, I feel quite confident that he'll be acquitted, obviously. If he's not acquitted, there will be an earthquake that I don't think this country has seen since the trial of John Brown. But assuming he's acquitted, the president will, of course, claim that he's innocent, because he is. But what I think needs to happen, and that I'm not sure will happen, is that the American people, that Donald Trump cannot just refute the argument, and he can't just refute the charges. He has to disassemble them. That's an entirely different thing. Entirely different thing. When somebody's accused of something like adultery, let's say, for example, in a candidate or something like that, somebody comes forward and says, yes, I had an affair with this person 17 years ago, and so on. The person who's been accused cannot just come out and say that didn't happen. They need to come out and say why it's impossible that it could have happened. And they need to remind people in that process that, look, I am innocent until proven guilty, but I understand that politics is a level well below normal discourse. And so even though they certainly have not proven my guilt, she says she did it, I did it, I say she didn't, there are plenty of reasons for people to come forward and knock down a presidential candidate. This is not like there's no motive here, right, Dr. Ford? And so, but you have to disassemble it. And this is the thing that I think is really just so important. You've got to show that what happened, or what has actually been accused, of happening, is either unlikely, impossible, or is so common in terms of procedure that for somebody to stand up and shriek about it is just plain It's just plain kind of nuts. It may not reflect well on you, but it's not criminal. It's not enough to, really take action on. And I think this is what the president needs to do. But look, ultimately, from the beginning, I just have to say this again because it has to be said. If there was compelling evidence and Republicans as well as Democrats had sought these charges, I would have to rethink my position. I'm not saying it would change my position. It would certainly cause me to rethink it and would certainly cause me to feel less confident about it and less good about it. So ultimately, in this game of bare knuckles, absolute disregard for any institutions, just as long as it's a grab for power, then ultimately Donald Trump's defense is to come out and point to the scoreboard. That's it. And if I was Donald Trump, I would never, ever, ever, ever talk about this nightmare without uttering the sentence, the presumption of innocence. I would not ever talk about it unless I put that in there somewhere. And then I would say also, the reason that the presumption of innocence is so important is because it is sometimes impossible to prove that you did not do something. You, in order to commit that you, in other words, if I accuse you of adultery and it's up to you to prove that you didn't do it, how do you prove that? How do you prove it? If somebody comes out, now there are plenty of women who've made charges against politicians who are 100% accurate. I'm not trying for the slightest bit to imply that they're all making up stories. On the contrary. But if you wanted to make up a story about infidelity and charge somebody about this and get yourself in all the newspapers and so on, if that person is innocent, how does he prove that it didn't happen? If you worked in the same office together 16 years ago and you said, "Do you know this woman?" "Yes, we worked together many years ago." "Well, she claims that you raped her in this office." Prove you didn't. How do you do that? How do you do it? I'm asking seriously, how do you do that? How do you prove that in the 7 years that you were working together that this did not happen? It's impossible to prove, and everybody knows it, which is why, in the interest of justice, not in the interest of politics, in the interest of justice, we have a philosophy that says that since it is impossible to prove you did not do something, you have to prove that you did it. Somebody has to prove that you did it. And if they can't, then you may have committed the crime, but you are legally not guilty as a means of protecting all of us against this kind of accusation. It is not possible for anybody watching this, liberal, conservative, whatever the case may be, there is no possibility that I could not, in the space of a couple of days going through your records, come up with an accusation about you that would either put you in jail or remove you from office, and which you would not be able to prove did not happen. And that's why this entire process is so repugnant, and that's why it's so important that we win this, and it's so important that we explain why we win it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the members at BillWhittle.com have made this and all of our shows each month possible. We've also received substantial support from our friends at the Patriot Post, America's news digest with the greatest memes on the conservative internet. If you go to the description below, you'll find a link to the Patriot Post. And we not only put it there in hopes that you click it, we encourage you to click it. I think you will find your time well rewarded for having done so. And I was thinking earlier today, one of the greatest things that my wife and I have ever had the privilege of doing was taking a Caribbean cruise. We've done this once in our lives. It was a big dang deal for us. We don't get out that much. And it was, I wonder, what was so great about it? Was it being out there on the beautiful, warm waters? Was it being able to walk across the sandy beaches with a coconut that has a straw coming out of it in your hand?
Mine has 5 umbrellas.
One of the things that struck me, though, was for those days, we never heard a car. It was just like the peace, the tranquility, obviously the luxury and the beauty of the weather and all that played into it. But was this idea where you've got to have a little time where you can step out of your ordinary course of life and just relax and rejuvenate. We are doing this in May, the 15th through the 18th on a 3-night cruise out of the port of Miami, bound for the Bahamas with a 1-day stop at Coco Cay, which is a private island on the Royal Caribbean Navigator of the Seas. And the reason I'm telling you this personal information is because I want you to come along with us. Me and
Right.
Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, who's our co-host at Right Angle at BillWhittle.com, will be there. A bunch of the members and fans and friends of the shows will be there as well. And I think you're going to find that you'll have every bit of the experience that my wife and I enjoyed years ago. Plus, you'll have the added benefit of something we didn't have at the time, which was being surrounded by friends, surrounded by people who are interesting and funny and fun to be with, people with
And
whom
who you
you're
can speak your mind in front of without having to,
that's right.
lower your voice. And yeah.
We had to go offshore to have these kind of conversations. So we welcome you to join us on that trip. I'll provide a link in the description below so that you can book your cabin on that cruise. Please do it quickly, though, because the deadline is fast approaching. And once that happens, we won't be able to sign anybody else up. And so we look forward to meeting you there on that cruise. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this possible.